Hello, and welcome to Words of Hope Mental Health Conversations. We are so glad that you've joined with us today. Over the next 4 weeks, we'll be looking at some incredibly important topics that can impact and affect our emotional health. We'll be looking at stress, anxiety, relationships, and loss. There'll be a short talk followed by a Q&A panel that will consist of mental health professionals, counsellors, pastors, and those who have walked through the issues we are discussing. We would love it if you find this helpful, that you take the time to share it and to pass it on. Let's spread the hope. Tonight, our topic is stress, and Steph Lowry will be leading that off, and then afterwards we'll have a Q&A.
So welcome to the first in our series on mental health conversations, and this evening we're going to be looking at the topic of stress. What is stress? I love the illustration of an airplane. So an airplane uses pressure of flying to its advantage. The pressure enables certain functions, and it enables the aircraft to function well and to perform well. But if the external pressure becomes too excessive, it will begin to crack, it'll begin to shudder, and eventually it will implode if that's not brought under control. Now, aren't you glad you're not going on holiday after that? But my point is that as humans, we are exactly the same. When external situations or pressures around us become too much, we begin to crack and we become unable to function normally. One of the definitions of stress is that stress is the feeling of being under too much pressure, mentally or emotionally. The pressure turns into stress, and then you feel unable to cope. That's not a surprise then to hear that between 75 and 90% of GP visits are stress-related ailments or complaints. So we can see that stress has a huge impact on our physical, our emotional, and our mental well-being, and therefore it's vital that we address it as individuals and as society. So what do I mean by all of this? Well, we all experience pressure or stress in our lives to some description, and it's not all bad. In fact, a certain amount of pressure can be very helpful. A certain amount of pressure motivates us, it challenges us, it pushes us towards our best, and it enables us to perform well. Conversely, if we have too little pressure in our lives, we become fatigued, we're inactive, and we often find it hard to find our purpose and to have a zeal for life. So how do we know when stress becomes dangerous and when it starts to go beyond the helpful? Well, there are some changes that you might notice. You may notice some difference in your thinking or your speaking. So you'll start to maybe think or say things like, this is too much, I can't cope with this, it's not fair, why am I doing all of this work? This is too much for me and I don't have enough time. You may begin to notice differences in how you feel, your emotions. You may become irritable, anxious, maybe bad-tempered, OTT, over-the-top reactions, and maybe an increased cynicism. You know, it's very, very difficult to find the good and to find fun in things, and maybe just not interested in the things that you normally would be. So what can we do about it? Do you know, there's a story in the Bible in Luke's Gospel, and it's about a woman who was suffering from the effects of stress. Her name is Martha, and her sister have Jesus come into their house. And so very quickly you begin to hear Martha's words turn into that of the stress language, as we would call it. She becomes very irritated very quickly by her sister's actions. She's just sitting talking to Jesus, doing nothing. And she's running around like this headless chicken, trying to prepare a meal and make sure everything's in its right place. And here comes the stress talk, and she says, you know, Mary, how can you just sit there and do nothing? And she says to Jesus, can you not get her to do something? Why is she just sitting there? You know, for me in particular, I find that very familiar. And it may seem like a simple story, but that's very often how we the place that we find ourselves. So the good thing is that there are things that we can do to help ourselves in these situations. And what is that? One of the strategies that we can put in place here is to have clear expectations. Now, if we just go back to that story again, we have Martha, and she is overcome by these false expectations that she has actually put on herself. Jesus isn't expecting the perfect home or the perfect meal, but this is what she has made up in her mind that is expected of her. In fact, all Jesus wants to do is spend time with her. So it's very important that when we find ourselves in these situations, when we are overwhelmed, that we pull back and we take a look and we realize, is this the actual expectation that is being placed on me, or is this something that's coming from within? Now, sometimes we do find ourselves in a position where it is external expectations and it is what is expected of us. And sometimes it requires a difficult conversation with maybe an employer or a family member just to say that you're struggling and that you cannot meet those expectations. So secondly, we want to clarify our limits. It's important here to recognize that we all are individuals, and therefore what might be extremely stressful to one individual may be perfectly manageable to someone else. For example, say for instance you have 8 pints of energy to be used in a day. You can look at your day and you can maybe pour your whole 8 pints into your work life, and then by the time you get home you have nothing left to give to your family, which again then will increase your stress levels and make life just even that more overwhelming for you. So it's important that you evaluate where you're spending most of your energy and what do you want to spend your energy on, and then distribute them accordingly. And sometimes this does take doing it a day by day to be able to release your stress levels. Finally, one of the hardest things that I think personally, and when I speak to other people and clients, is the ability to be able to create clear boundaries. There's a very small word in our vocabulary and it's only got 2 letters, and it's the word no, but it's the hardest word to say sometimes. And sometimes just being able to say no can relieve our stress levels. Often we say yes to the things that we cannot do. We go beyond our means, again, our limits. But there's another reason why sometimes we continue to say yes to the things that are being asked of us. Dr. Henry Cloud, a very well-known psychologist, he says this: saying no often means we give away something of our freedom in order to say yes to something that we want. Now, what does that actually mean? It means that sometimes I will say yes to you because maybe I need to feel accepted by you. So in order for me to feel accepted by you, I will say yes to something that you want me to do. And therefore, I then take on stuff that I cannot do, or I don't have the time to put into place. But for you, it could be something different. It could be our status. You may need to feel loved. You may need to feel needed. And therefore, we need to ask ourselves the very personal question: why do I always say yes and find it so difficult to say no? I want to thank you for joining us this evening, and I hope that you have found this helpful. And please stay with us as we have our question and answers time and we look into this subject just a little deeper. Thank you.
Well, welcome to our panel where we delve in a little bit deeper to what Steph talked about in the whole area of stress. Thanks, Steph, for your talk. Really appreciate the things that you communicated there. And we're also joined by Vicky McAvoy and Johnny Redmond. And I think it'd be really good just for you guys to be able to introduce yourselves. So why don't we go ladies first? And then Johnny, you bring up the rear if you can. And we'll start with Steph and Vicky and then Johnny. Thank you.
Well, hi, my name is Steph Lowry. I am married to John and I have 3 boys, Jonathan and Cameron and Max, and I have a little grandson, Ezra. We are currently down in Beersbridge Road, Elim. My husband's a pastor there, and so I do a lot of work with him in the church. We also head up like a community project called 47H, which I manage. And when I'm not doing all that, then I work as a counsellor.
And I'm Vicky McAvoy. I work in from home actually now, and I also do some counsellor training in Belfast in the Culloden Hotel, and also in Edinburgh for a consultancy called Vital Connections. I'm married to John, and we're currently in the Elim Church in Tala, and John heads up the work in the south of Ireland. So we've got 3 kids and 7 grandchildren. And counting. Okay.
Hi, I'm Johnny Redmond, and I am an Elim pastor in Carrickfergus. I've got 2 kids, Abby and Joshua, 1 wife, Alison, and I've been in ministry as long as Alistair has. In fact, we were kind of in at the same time. And great joy to be in Elim ministry, and great joy to be pastoring with folks, and looking forward to this today, looking forward to learning from these wonderful women just about how to be less stressful.
Brilliant, that's great. So tonight's topic has been on stress, and Steph outlined what stress looked like and why it comes and how we experience it. Johnny, as you heard Steph's talk, can you relate to some of the stuff she was telling us about?
Absolutely. From the start of it, as soon as she started talking about internal pressure and external pressure, I was in, because in church ministry, in local church ministry, and we're only a small, medium-sized Elim church, the pressure of expectation, the pressure of self-expectation, and then of the expectation of those in your congregation, in those in your town, those in your family. Sometimes what's happening outside, which you don't have a whole lot of say over, has a really detrimental effect inside. And certainly for me, that is my experience. The plane analogy was beautiful. When the external pressure is greater than the internal pressure can take, you've got a calamity, you've got a problem. And I would say I could totally identify with that analogy, and actually with the whole idea of stress being a universal problem, not just to those in high-powered seats, but to us all.
Yeah, thanks, Johnny. Steph, is it possible to be stressed and not fully realize it? So I'm sort of thinking, there'll be people watching this and thinking, I'm not stressed. But I suppose my question is this: what are some of the signs that we might be stressed?
Yeah, well, I suppose I touched on it a wee bit in the talk. We all face stress at some point, but to be under an unusual amount of stress, I suppose we would notice it more. You often hear when people go on holidays, they come back and they go, I didn't realize how stressed I was until I was away, or until I took some time out and suddenly realized what it was like to come back down to normal again. So although we may not be aware of it, there will be signs and symptoms for it. And you may feel like you've a bad stomach, and you go to the doctors and he tells you you've got an ulcer, and the first thing he'll say to you is, have you got a stressful lifestyle? Because stress has a huge impact on your physical well-being, your mental well-being, your emotional well-being. So although you may not call it stress, there will be signs and symptoms there, and it's important we identify them so we can deal with it.
Yeah, it's good. So, Vicky, as a counsellor, if someone comes in to you and really they're just stressed, how do you sort of go about helping that person?
Well, I have had a lot of clients over the years who have been stressed, and it's something that's very familiar to all of us, I think, both who are listening and who are watching this and who are taking part in it. But what I do with stressed people is the same as what I do with anybody who comes to me with a difficulty, and I try to really, really listen to their story, and I try to listen with my heart to their heart. One of the keys is don't try to fix or tell them what to do or give them advice, which is the first place, the default that we go to, especially if my kids come to me and they're stressed. I would say, do this, do that, don't worry. But with clients, actually, I'm a lot better, and I try to understand what it's like to actually walk in their shoes. I try to help them to feel understood, that somebody gets them, somebody's witnessing that part of their life and their experience. It's very, very real in the time and in the moment. And actually, even though that sounds easy, it's quite difficult to do. But neuroscience teaches us that that actually settles down this part of our brain here, which is the limbic system. And by listening to somebody and connecting with them, those little mirror neurons start firing, and that person actually starts feeling a lot better. The Bible says, share one another's burdens. So the Bible and God certainly understands, because he created us, that we need connection. We need somebody to listen to us, and we need somebody to understand. And you know what? You don't have to be a counselor to do that. Any one of us can do that with our grandchildren, with our kids, with our husbands, our wives, our friends. Just really be present to them. And another thing that I do once I've done that is to try and drill just that little bit deeper. And behind every stress, there's always a fear or a longing. And so if somebody's stressing over, teenagers stressing over exams, underneath that stress and all the activity and the physical symptoms that go with that, is usually a fear. And so if you can gently ask them, so what is it that you're really worried about in this? You get in a softer space where they might say, well, if I fail this exam, my whole life will be ruined. And then you're down to the bedrock of what's really going on for them. And often people are catastrophizing what would happen. I know today, even coming on doing this, I was trying to think, what do we do? And I tried that on myself. Nobody listened to me, but I tried to think, what's the fear? What am I afraid of? And when you answer that question, it's probably that this won't be good enough, or that people will think this is daft, or we won't be as good as Malcolm Duncan or Edwin Michael or Steph was, or something. And once you actually get a chance to say that out loud, then you sometimes realize that it's not as realistic and it will be good enough. So I hope that's a little bit helpful, but it's listening, understanding, and trying to get a little bit deeper and to be curious and try to draw out, what's really going on underneath. Those medical tests that you're waiting for, underneath is the fear that maybe I've got cancer or something awful. The financial worries, maybe I'll lose my house, maybe something terrible. And so everybody's got their own set of fears, or stresses. But behind that often is a fear or a longing for something.
Yeah, no, that's really, really helpful. Because I think the reality is, just tying the two together with Steph and Vicky, I think some of us can be going through life and maybe it hasn't quite hit the peak, but there's a lot of stress going on in their lives. So, for example, he'll kill me for saying this, but I've noticed my dad hasn't stopped since lockdown. He's painted the garage floor. If it's bolted down and if it's there, it's painted. And a lot of people are like him. And I would say probably that's that underlying stress, that I know that's the way I deal with things. My sleep pattern goes away a little bit. And then I become very active and try to control what's around me. And I think that's a thing of stress. And what you're saying there, Vicky, is really, yes, getting someone to understand, but then drilling down deep and understanding what's the fear, what's the longing. I think that's really, really helpful for us. So, Steph, I really enjoyed in your talk whenever you talked about Martha and the story of Martha. And I hadn't thought about it before, but as soon as you started to talk about her in the context of what you were saying, I thought that just makes so much sense. And one of the things I loved out of that was the area of expectations and how she had this expectation upon her. But one of the ways that she could have dealt with her stress, and we can, is to have clear expectations. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so obviously this is huge, and it's this, and again, going back to what Vicky says about fears and longings and the expectations and how that all unfolds. But I suppose we all have an idea of what we think is expected of us. I think one of the first analogies that came to me is, again, maybe Christmas time. Families are under this immense pressure at Christmas time. Now, on the surface, it may seem silly, but we have this idea that we have to provide the best gift and the most perfect meal with all the trimmings. We have to sing the best carols and do all of the activity. There's this idea that if we don't do everything, then Christmas is a failure. And actually, it's not. It's the expectation of what something is supposed to look like. But in actual fact, that's not reality. That's not what it's meant to look like, and we put ourselves under these false expectations. So it's this idea of, we often use in counselling, of like the helicopter, and we, like when the helicopter's on the ground pad, it just sees what's initially around it and what's close, but when it starts to take off, it sees things from a distance, and it puts perspective on and shines the light on the things that should be shined on. And I think it's a really good exercise to use in our life, that if we pull it right back and look at it, we can see, do you know what, that's actually not what my kids want from me for Christmas. That they want my time, they want my love, and it's actually recognizing those. Now, it's true to say that there are expectations that are put on us externally. Maybe you've got a boss who expects just way too much from you, and I think this is where we have to help ourselves with a wee bit of courage, which is very difficult to do when you're stressed. But sometimes we need to have difficult conversations with those who are expecting too much, and be honest and allow ourselves to be vulnerable and say, I just cannot meet those unrealistic expectations, and bring it back. And like Vicky was saying, recognizing what is the fear in that, what is my longing in that, what do I want to prove in this. And when she was saying, when you actually say that out loud, or when you face that, it makes it somehow so much easier to deal with, and we kind of be able to make a pathway with that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. I love that illustration of the helicopter and coming up and just getting a bigger view of where things are, because we can just get so caught up in the minutiae and in the moment that we lose that perspective. Probably to use an illustration that's more akin to Johnny and I, a football manager, who so often is in the dugout and he just sees it on this level. But there have been those, I think Sam Allardyce would have done this quite a bit, and he goes up into the stand so that he can have a bigger view of what's going on. And sometimes we need to go up into the stand and have a look and see everything that's going on, and have a greater perspective. And I think that's really good. So thank you for that. Johnny, I think this leads on to the next one, because we can have these expectations that are external. And I think one of the things that Steph talked about was then setting clear boundaries. So how do we do that, and how do we help manage stress through healthy boundaries?
For me, and I can only speak for me, this is an area that I have not been good at doing. I've had to learn kind of on the journey, because Ali, as you know, at Bible college, they don't teach you about setting boundaries. They teach you theology and they teach you other things, but there's not this idea that you will need to say the dreaded no to some people. And in ministry, I found that difficult to say no. I said to Steph the other day, we were chatting, in my town, there are 13 primary schools who have all invited me to come in every month to speak. Now, most people are going, what an opportunity. For me, I had to choose to say no to 11 of the 13, because I could already feel myself being stressed with the thought of being in here, as well as doing all of the ministry, as well as the uncertainty. But the one thing that I noticed for me as a telltale sign is when I say no and I feel relieved, there's not the same fear as when I say no and I feel disappointed. And sometimes when I say no and I feel disappointed, maybe I revisit it and say, maybe I should have said yes. Maybe that was a God opportunity. There's that fear of missing out, isn't there? Which is all around. And it's no different for those in ministry. It's no different for anyone. That fear that if I'm not there, something will happen and I'll have missed out on it. I was thinking, forgive me for dropping a Bible verse in, but it's part of our job. I was thinking of Paul writing to the Corinthians, and in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, and he says that that what has happened to them in Asia happened for a reason, that they would have confidence not in themselves, but in God. And one of the things that I've noticed in dealing with stress and setting boundaries is to say, God, I have confidence that when I say no and feel relieved, that actually that was something you did not have for me. And when I say no and have a disappointment, maybe that was something you had for me, and maybe I need to faithfully go back again. In church ministry, if you're any use at anything in life in general, you'll get 1,000 invitations. And even if you're not good like me, you'll still get 100 invitations. So it's saying expectation externally. I can't do it all, so I would rather do less and do it well. That's how I've come to terms with it. I'd rather do less than do it well, than do more and do it half-heartedly or to less of my ability. And the other thing with boundaries was, so my family matters, my children matter. You know, they're things that really matter. And therefore, rather than give them just what's left, there has to be boundaries with family life. There has to be boundaries with marriage. There has to be boundaries with church. There has to be boundaries with study time. There has to be boundaries everywhere. And I have to be willing to say no in all of those areas. Otherwise, it can be stressful being a dad. It can be stressful being a husband, especially around birthdays, anniversaries, and things like that. So it's learning how to find balance. I loved your analogy of going to the stand to look down and get a different perspective. I think that's a good example. And sometimes we got to withdraw to see, actually, this will go on without us. So they're the things that I've kind of done. I've learned to say no and be okay about it. And I've learned to say yes and allow God to lead me in that.
Yeah, no, it's really good. Thank you, Johnny. And it got me thinking, and I don't think this is just a church thing, you know. So I'll use a word that sounds like a Christian word, but I think that you mentioned, well, you didn't mention FOMO, but fear of missing out. You know, this whole thing of I don't want to miss a thing. But do you think that there's a lot of Messiah complex at times? Like, if I don't do that, then it's not going to go well. And not necessarily that people in themselves feel, oh, I am the bee's knees, but there's kind of a responsibility thing. So it might be for some people in work. It might be for mothers. You know, I'm thinking of a lot of the mums and dads who are having to homeschool, and they're putting a lot of pressure on themselves. If I don't do this perfect, then they're going to go into P2 or P3 and they're not going to learn enough. Do you think there's something in some of that?
Absolutely. I think that there's what did you say, keeping up with the Joneses? I think there's all that expression of if I don't have this, then in some way I am robbing my family or robbing myself or robbing this experience. And the truth is, it goes on. Do you know what I discovered about the 13 schools? The 11 I turned down, other people took up and did a great job at. So it wasn't reliant upon me. So I think that no matter what we do, to be able to step back, look down and say, this will go on without me. My father retired a number of years ago. And do you know what he said to me the day after he retired is, everybody will get up and go to church on Sunday. And they'll say, what a great guy George was, but it'll just go on. And I think that's the reality for us all, with the Messiah complex anyway.
Yeah. Oh, that's good, Johnny. Thank you. So, Vicky, give us some top tips for dealing with stress.
I think it's good, what I do with clients and with myself as well, it's remembering, I suppose, what's actually happening in a stress reaction. And so what is actually happening, and to understand in our bodies what happens under stress, is that our nervous system floods with cortisol and adrenaline. And so those stress hormones flood into our system immediately. And so in a situation of real physical danger, this is very helpful, you know, because if, for example, a lion comes into the room, so those of you watching at home, if you imagine a lion walking into your sitting room or wherever you're watching, immediately your body would react, and that would enable you to fight, flight, or freeze. I'm familiar with those terms. And the brain actually doesn't discriminate between the real danger of a lion and perceived danger. And so in a stress situation, we haven't got a physical line, but we have a perceived danger, something that's threatening us. And this back part of our brain here is the part that takes over. And this front part of our brain, which is the frontal lobe, goes offline. And so this front part of our brain is the part of our brain that solves problems, that thinks strategically, that's very sensible, and is able to problem solve. And so if you're in a stressful situation, or if you're in an argument with somebody, you go into back brain, you react instead of respond, and that takes your thinking, your sensible thinking time, and you say and think things, you fight, flight, or freeze, or you say daft things that you wish you hadn't said, or that you wish you hadn't done, or you forget all that you've learnt for your exams. And it actually takes about 20 minutes for that cortisol to physically drain from your body. So it's quite good to know that. I remember my mum saying to me, count to 10, but actually 10 isn't enough. It takes minutes for you to, debrief and for that cortisol to flood away. And worse than that, those of us, and particularly in this COVID-19 time, who are living in real situations of stress, some of the people in the NHS, people driving buses who are actually in real, not just perceived danger, they become hyper-vigilant, and after months of stressful environments, people living in domestic violence, maybe living in dangerous neighbourhoods, doing stressful jobs that really do matter, that really affects our bodies, as Steph was saying. And so there's a little list, and I don't know if maybe we can put them up on the website afterwards or on the Facebook page. Stuff like walking, running, and physical exercise actually dispels or burns off that cortisol. And so those are really good things to do. Things like having a good sleep, easier said than done when you're stressed. But trying to really mindfully approach bedtime, without our screens and our televisions, just to wind down so that we do get a good night's sleep. Really, really important. We hear a lot about relaxation techniques or quietening your heart before God. I found that very, very helpful. And I know when I used to be coming back from Oasis, which was a counselling service that I ran, very, very stressful, listening to people all day. And I used to put on gentle worship in the car on the way home, which was about a 20-minute run home. I used to go the back roads. And by the time I got home, it was like that worship had just washed over my soul. I was able to go home and then be with my family. So we'll put up the list: talking to trusted friends, managing your time better, that's a tough one, making time for laughter. Good question for all of us: when did we last have a good belly laugh? Because it's hard to be stressed when we're laughing from our guts. So there's a project for all of you tonight: find some way of laughing out loud. Really, really good. Using our thought life is another one. The Bible says, whatsoever things are lovely, whatever's true, what's a good report. Actually choosing to think good thoughts and happy thoughts, and not watching the news at the moment 10 times a day. I was getting stressed just watching the news. And so I just listen once a day, and that's it. Things like caffeine, alcohol, high sugar levels. It's not good in stress, but we all go there. And finally, because I'm sure our time is gone, the simple things in life, like just talking to God conversationally, is so, so important. Just being able to invite His presence, His grace into our stressful situations, and handing it all over to Him. Because having done all, sometimes we just have to say, God, it's over to you. And I don't know what I would do in my life if I didn't have that resource to hand stuff over to God.
Yeah, thanks, Becky. That's great. Have you guys anything to add to that? Tips on dealing with stress?
Just be still and know that I am God. The great evangelist and revivalist Jonathan Edwards said that was his life pursuit, was to understand and live out that verse. Be still and know that I am God. And I think in stressful situations, there are those times when I don't identify stress, but I feel overwhelmed. That's a verse, a go-to verse, to stop, be still in God's presence and say, God, what are you saying? Or what do I need to do? Or or do I need to do nothing? So always let the Bible lead us in those things.
Yeah, it's good stuff. So, Johnny, because we only have you for this panel, wanted to ask you this last question then. The guys will be joining us for other things. But, there's going to be different people from different backgrounds. Obviously, we're from a church movement, so we are coming with a faith perspective on this. But we hope that what we're saying is helpful for everyone from every background. But I think it would be really good for us to communicate, because we all get stressed. We all face everything that comes in life, no matter what our label is. But my question would be for you, what difference does having God in the mix make to the stuff we're talking about?
Oh, huge. I think I am a worrier by design, and therefore to have God with us, that place where I can go to be with him in silence and in solitude with his word and with his spirit, and allow, I don't know how he does it, but allow God to transform and to calm the storms inside of me is huge. I don't know how I would get through each day, never mind the bad days, if it was just me. But God has this wonderful ability through his spirit and his word to bring peace in the storms. I think you see it in Jesus, don't you? When he's walking on the water and he says, peace be still, and it's still. So whether you're in faith or you're out of faith, God is there. He's a very present help in times of trouble. And anyone can call upon him. He says, call on me. And so for me, I would be someone who calls regularly. And I encourage those people who I come across. I work in another area of chaplaincy and sport. And I say to the players all the time, why are you carrying this yourself? Just ask God. He's there. And sometimes they say interesting things, but will he listen to me? Well, the character of God is that he listens to everybody. He hears us. His ear is inclined towards us. So I think that we can come to him and say, God, be there. And for me, it has been the lifeline in the worst moments of my life, the biggest stressful moments, and really the darkest pits, is to have him there has been great. And I call a lot. I'm a caller unto God.
It's brilliant, Johnny. Thank you so much. And thank you for each of you for joining us in the panel, for Steph, for your talk, and for what you've brought in terms of answers to the questions you've been given. Vicky as well, thank you so much for taking the time. And Johnny, for sharing from where you're coming from too. We really, really appreciate you doing that. For those of you who are watching, thank you for taking the time to be with us. Thank you for tuning in. We encourage you, if you found this helpful, to share it to some people that might also need just to find a little bit of hope in whatever they're going through right now. So again, thank you for that. And if you have questions about faith, or if you're really struggling with some other areas, then please do visit our webpage. Go to elimchurchireland.com, and there'll be resources on there. Also, contact us at info@elimchurchireland.com, and we will do our best to signpost you to wherever, whatever the right help is for you to be able to get. So thanks again for tuning in. Tune in next week. We're going to be looking at the issue of anxiety. These guys won't have any of that because they don't have this to do next week, but thank you so much. And if you have questions around the area of anxiety that you would like submitted to the panel, then do get in touch. Send an email to us or contact us via the social media posts, and we'll do our best to include as many questions in that as possible. But for now, thank you for being with us. God bless.